What it meant to be an American was very much contingent, meaning that it was in flux. And it was actively being defined by both forces within Utah Territory and in particular forces outside of Utah Territory.
The founding of America did not mean freedom and independence for many people, but it did for some.
The first 4 men to enter the Salt Lake Valley to help settle the valley, 3 of those 4 men were black. The 5th richest man in all of Utah Territory was a black rancher. Many of those black folks who were coming to Utah at the time were pursuing freedom, pursuing religious freedom, freedom from racism, freedom from economic oppression. Utah actually offered that for them for a while.
Preach, brother.
To divorce the idea of the American West from the identity of what it means to be American. I don't think it can be, because it helps to define what it means to be American.
Us coming together now commemorating this is to think about the different results and what that means, because now we're all here together in this country moving forward.
I'm going to celebrate the heck out of the America being 250 years old. It's important. Commemoration, though, allows for multiple truths, complexity, and reflection. Not everyone's experienced this founding as freedom. For some, the founding meant independence, opportunity, and self-governance. For others, it meant dispossession, enslavement, and exclusion. Commemoration honors all of those realities.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alana Blumenthal, and I am the director of the Brigham City Museums. I would like to thank you for attending tonight's program, Revolutionary Roots, How the Founding Documents and Westward Expansion Shaped Utah. Brigham City Museum of Art and History is a department of the Brigham City Corporation. Additional support for our exhibitions and programs comes from the Box Elder Museum Foundation, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums, and our community members. This program is supported by the Utah Department of Cultural and Community Engagement as a part of their America 250 Utah Speaker Series. We also thank them for their support in providing us with the Traveling Pen is Mightier exhibition, which I hope you had time to view downstairs in the museum. If not, please take some time after the program to check out this important historical display during its only appearance in Box Elder County, which ends this Saturday. We have a fascinating conversation with a deeply passionate panel of speakers prepared for you this evening, so I won't take up any more time. I would like to start by inviting Brigham City Mayor DJ Bott to say a few words of welcome before we turn it over to our panelists.
Thank you, Alana. Is that on? You can turn it off. Is it on? Yeah, it's on. Sorry. Thank you. I'm honored this evening to introduce tonight's panel, not the individual panelists, but the subject matter, what the federal expansion meant to the building of Utah. So we are an official America 250 community here in Brigham City. In fact, I learned today that the bus that's going to be coming around and kicking that off through each of the states, Brigham City is the only city that's currently on the stop in Utah. So we get to represent Utah on that tour, which I thought was pretty amazing. But a little old Brigham City. But it makes sense, right? Because the whole nation at one point ran right through Brigham City with the Transcontinental Railroad. And I enjoy the fact that it's 250 years of the founding of America. The centennial was a big part of my life. I was only 6 years old in 1976. But that's when I started to become aware of red, white, and blue and patriotism, and it really shaped my attitude and my opinion of my country and my devotion and patriotism to it. I'm not a native of Brigham City, although my last name would indicate that I am, where my ancestors all started here in Brigham City, but I grew up like in Davis County and didn't move here till I was in high school. But I always equated Brigham City with patriotism because my first experience had to have been in like 1980, and the fire hydrants around town were still painted red, white, and blue like little patriotic soldiers. I don't know if anybody remembers that or not. I'm trying really hard with Public Works and Risk Management to replicate that, but they keep fighting me in the city. But I'd really like to do that this year. But really, Brigham City, I think we're kind of unique, and the panelists will speak not to this point, but hopefully validate my opinion of Brigham City. I don't know that there's a city that has a bigger melting pot effect in Utah. with the Transcontinental Railroad. Between the pioneers, the systems, and then the cultures that all participated, whether by force or by pay, in the joining of our nation, it was all converged right here in Box Elder County. This was the end, right, out at the Golden Spike Memorial. And a lot of those folks, thankfully, stuck around and settled right here. We all grew up with friends here that have Asian last names, and they're all very close to us. And we have a lot of folks that are indigenous people to the Americas. We all grew up with them, and they were our friends. And so Brigham City is unique in my mind. I don't know whether that'll bear out in the panel, but I want to let you know that I think it's unique because of our history and our proximity to the Golden Spike National Monument. But I was only assigned 2 to 3 minutes, and I am a politician, so I am known to go over time. That's not because of politics, it's because I like to talk. But I will turn the time over to Jami, who is going to be the moderator of our panel. If we can give them a round of applause.
Thank you, Mayor Bott, for that. I just wanted to introduce myself very quickly. My name is Jami Van Huss, and I wear a few different hats, but I am here tonight as one of the co-curators of the exhibition that you'll see downstairs called The Pen is Mightier, Writing a Revolution. I live over just in Cache Valley. I was born and raised there, which is why I have a weird Dutch last name, because I was already related to everybody in Cache Valley, so I had to find a husband who was not from Utah. But anyway, so I run a small museum over in Hiram City there, but I also was hired by the state of Utah, by the Department of Culture and Community Engagement, to curate two exhibitions for the America 250, one being The Pen is Mightier. And so the exhibition that you have seen or will see downstairs is actually a condensed selection of panels from a larger exhibition that's currently on exhibit at the state capitol. It wraps the entire 4th floor. There's over 60 panels. It will be up all year. So if you do have a chance to go down and see that, it's open and free. Capitol has I think that it's open from like 7 a.m. till 8 p.m. almost every day. So you can see that. And I feel like a lot of what we actually today are going to talk about is not so much covered on the exhibition downstairs, but you will see bits of it in that exhibit. So if you find yourself in Salt Lake in this semi-quincentennial year, make sure you visit the Capitol. I think we'll start by letting the panelists introduce themselves. Go next.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Kerri Clement. I am an assistant professor of history at Weber State University, where I specialize in history of America's public lands, particularly national parks, animal history, critical indigenous studies, as well as disease history. I'm originally from Montana, but I also feel quite a lot of kinship to Utah because of its public lands.
Okay. My name is Robert Burch, and I am the founder and executive director of Same Deep African American Heritage and Culture. And we do one thing and one thing only, that is we research, preserve, and share the history of African Americans in Utah and the Utah Territory since the mid-1800s. I am also a member of the Utah Board of State History to help communities figure out how to tell their stories. I know I focus mostly on African American communities, but we help all communities in being able to tell their story. And that's important to me because that's the reason I named our organization Sema Aditi. Sema Aditi is Swahili for tell the story. If you do your family history and you don't share it, it's just family history. But when you share it with the community, it becomes public history, Utah history, American history. And so we really want to get communities to tell the stories of their communities. And I am also on the National Board of Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, which is a lineage society. We help people trace their ancestry back to enslavement and document that and celebrate those ancestors. So I am really excited to be here. And we actually just took down our exhibit from the state capitol. So we had a small exhibit there for about 6 months, and looking forward to 2027 because Jami took all the space upstairs. We have to wait till next year. But I'm glad to be here. Glad to see you guys.
Well, I feel like this is a home game for me. My name's Darren Parry. I live 5 minutes away from here. I'm the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. For a long time, our tribal headquarters was here in Brigham City. So I have many friends and loved ones here. And good people are here. In the fall, I teach at the University of Utah. In the spring, I get to teach at Utah State University and share my indigenous culture with anybody who will listen. It's an honor for me to be here to represent a people that have always been here. We celebrate America being 250 years old, but I got a little news for you. And you might hear some of that tonight. But, it's a pleasure to be here and just share a perspective that's not saying it's right or wrong, it's just a different perspective. And as long as we can celebrate each other's perspectives, then I think we're all good. So grateful to be a part of this panel.
All right, thank you. So tonight we're going to start with the Brigham City Museum's mission, which is to tell the stories of the people and the land. I think that's a wonderful mission, and it's what we based the questions for tonight off of, looking through the lens of this exhibition and exploring how American ideals such as liberty and freedom are tied to the land through concepts such as discovery, migration, the military, and public access to the landscape. And so I feel like Darren started this idea just a moment ago, so I'd like to explore the concept a little bit more of the idea of discovery. What does discovery mean when we're speaking about lands that had been inhabited by thousands, if not millions of people for time immemorial? What did the founding of the country mean for Indigenous people?
Well, my granddaughter came home from school, kindergarten, and said, "Papa, I learned today that Columbus discovered America." And I like to keep things age appropriate with her. And I said, one day we'll have a discussion. But how can you discover a land that's been inhabited for time immemorial? The discovery of America is a colonial narrative, but it's not a historical truth. The founding of America did not mean freedom and independence for many people, but it did for some, but not everybody. The loss of land and undermining sovereignty, removal, all of those things led up to something else. And so that term discovery means something different to me. And I don't know, I think the more I want to frame it is what we have a chance to do with America 250 and discovery. And I think we have a chance, it invites us to finally tell the whole story and not just the celebratory one. We need to recognize that those first inhabitants are still here. And the question really for me tonight is not whether America should celebrate. The question should be, is America ready to tell the truth? A strong nation, I believe, is built on honesty, relationships, and respect. And I hope that's something that we can all honor one of these days soon.
Go ahead.
When I looked at this question earlier, Jami, the thing that struck me with discovery, is that a lot of times when we say discovery, it means that we've learned something new for the first time. And so for the Europeans, discovery in the simplest sense was that, oh, look at what we've learned for the first time. I think that connotation of discovery as if it did not exist is something that is created in myth over the last couple of hundred years. Because I don't think that everyone who actually went out and explored the world went out thinking that there were no people there. Many of them went out with the idea that there's somebody over there and let's go see who it is and let's go learn about other people. Because even right up into 1776 with the Spanish were going through Florida, the Caribbean, Central America, South America. They made it all the way around, along with the English, all the way around the tip of South America and come up on the other side on the Pacific Ocean, and just is in general exploration. I think that the word discovery in its current context is really just something that is a modern ideal of, dare to say, self-aggrandizement. One of the things, our theme for Sima Hadithi is unity through historical truth. And I believe in what Darren is saying is that until we have those difficult conversations about what the truth of the matter is, then these distortions that we've created over the last 200, 300, 400 years are going to continue to make it difficult to have the kind of peace and reconciliation among people that so many of us would like to have. But we have to get unbound by these narrative-like discovery that kind of tarnishes really what the story of America is.
Just really quickly. As I'm reflecting on what both of you said so eloquently and wonderfully, one of the things that I think would be useful for myself at least to think through is what is the myth doing, particularly in relation to the myth of the doctrine of discovery, which is a phrase that is often used in federal Indian law around why is it that the federal government had the ability to make treaties with indigenous tribes or even to take indigenous land. And so I always encourage my students, when we are thinking through historical truth versus historical myth and historical narrative, which are all three separate things, although they often are overlapping, is what is the myth doing? Who is gaining from that myth and who is potentially being asked or forced to give something up because of that myth? And I think for the United States, when we think about 250, one of the things that is worth really sitting down with and feeling the uncomfortable feelings is this moment of, is it reconciliation or is it further perpetuating of myth that is costing other Americans or other people present in North America their own history and their own stakes in the history. And I'm sure both of you as well could too, is talk about the long-term actual consequences historically for particularly marginalized communities in the United States for what this idea of discovery does. But I guess I'm just reminded, or I would remind us to be thinking through with these myth making, which is an active process in and of itself, what is being cost or what is being asked to be in many ways even extracted from in some communities or what is at the expense of these communities for the benefit of others? Who is gaining and who is losing? And so when we think through doctrine of discovery, in particular indigenous peoples, but also as well other historically marginalized communities are also often at the cost of this discovery narrative.
So that kind of leads me to two other thoughts. Again, going back to this idea of discovery, I think it's really important to note, I know that when I was first hired to curate a 250 exhibit, people were like, well, that's not a Utah story. What are you going to talk about? That's Boston Tea Party and Paul Revere, what is happening in Utah in 1776. And one very distinct, well-known historical event that happened in the land that would become Utah is the Dominguez Escalante expedition, which actually happened in 1776. And as I began my research, I was really fascinated again with this concept of discovery, because and again thinking about the trajectory of the foundation of the country, particularly to Native peoples and other disenfranchised people, how that paralleled right here in Utah as you have the first non-native explorers coming in and documenting the land in a written way. So the expedition produces a map and also a set of journals. And so these are the first non-native produced written documentation of Utah's landscape. And so we do have this very Utah story that runs along the same ideas, the same ideals as the revolution, as these Spanish friars are discovering lands in Utah, actually being shown them by native scouts. And I think in the idea, oh my gosh, my brain. To save time, let's not dive too much into Dominguez Escalante. If you want to go there, we can go there. But I also really think it's more interesting and maybe more, I guess I'm in charge, so we're going to go this direction because it's my decision. I really like this idea that all of the panelists talked about, is this idea of perspective. So me as a historian, this is what I love about history. I grew up here in northern Utah, and and all of my history was very much from one perspective. And for me personally, where that started to change was on a Sunday afternoon. As a little girl, we drove up to the massacre site. Darren's heard me tell the story before. And I remember reading the DUP panel that's there at the massacre site, where it mentions the combatant women and children, the Shoshone women and children. And I remember as a child, well, I was like 10 maybe, my dad pointing that out to me and being like, what do you think about that? What do you think about them calling women and children combatants? And that was the first time I started having this inkling of history is not what's written in a book by a person. That's a perspective. And what I love about the work that all three of these scholars do is helping us look at things from different perspectives that are all valid. There is not one true right history. There's not one historical truth. There's things that come from myth. There's perspectives. And we as critically thinking citizens need to take into account other people's perspectives. And so that's what I love about this conversation that we're having, is the opportunity for all of us to think about things from a perspective that maybe we haven't before. And so let's jump into Manifest Destiny.
No biggie.
Through the lens of expanding resources. That's all. I'm just going to leave it there.
Wow, this could go wrong in so many ways. When I started down the road of Manifest Destiny, it was probably 25 years ago, around 2000, when someone made the comment to me that there's no such thing as institutional racism. And being black in America, my first response was automatic. Of course there is. But stepping back and looking at it critically, I asked myself, really, is it institutionalized? And just so that led me down this road of investigating Manifest Destiny and what I thought about it, felt about it, and what historians and other people have said about it. And I think, without a doubt, after the last 25 years, I've reached a conclusion that there is a such thing as institutionalized racism, because part of it became institutionalized in the culture, and with the culture itself being an institution. And so when a parent teaches a child a way to do something that becomes institutionalized in the community and the culture, then it's institutional. So manifest destiny struck me simply because it sounds biblical. I thought, okay, somebody's really playing on religion here and not just politics. They're using religion to support their politics. And begin to understand how Christianity, Islam, and even the religious fervor of European economics creates this idea of manifest destiny, which comes at the expense of not just the United States and the people who lived on this continent prior to 1550s when Europeans first came here, but as well as people in Africa, people in Australia, people in China, people in South America, the Caribbean, and Central America. This idea of European dominance and preeminence has touched just about every part of the world. And so I began to understand that manifest destiny is not just about the United States. It's about European sense of dominance over the entire planet, and the kind of harm that it has caused people all over the planet. And honestly, my opinion, and again, this is just Robert Burch, that it is all economic driven. Because even when you look at 1619, when you have many of the first Africans being brought from Angola into Port Comfort, Virginia, this is done out of economics. I mean, the Portuguese have been down in Angola for 200 years already, and then after 200 years they discover a big cache of silver, and the Portuguese just start rounding up African leadership and shipping them off all over the world. And so it's economic in that sense. Around 1700, you have Europe that has 30% unemployment rate, and they have a bunch of men sitting around with no work and creating crime. And Europe is faced with, what do we do with these young men who are not doing anything? Well, we put them on a ship, we send them to the United States, we send them to Africa, we send them to South America. We find something, we put them in an army and send that army all over the world. And so this, and I know this has been long-winded, but this, to me, the idea of manifest destiny is really, it comes out of an economic imperative propped up by religion.
Do you want to go, Kerri?
Do you want to go?
Well, let me just say this really quickly. I write a lot about manifest destiny. In fact, I call the 24th of July Pioneer Day, Manifest Destiny Day.
Wow.
But that's on a local level. So Manifest Destiny was here long before the pioneers got here. So I look at Manifest Destiny in two ways. One way is it framed expansion as inevitable. And that I agree with. I think expansion, taking more land, was inevitable in the climate that they lived in back then. The other part, though, which is the most important part of Manifest Destiny, is that it is divinely sanctioned. Well, that becomes a problem. Because we can do anything in the name of religion, right? Anything. As long as it's in the name of the religion. So Manifest Destiny became a strategic way to secure resources and prevent foreign powers from controlling land. Indigenous people that were already here were treated as obstacles to that goal. And So while it was a national thing, long before it was a Utah thing, it quickly became a Utah thing when people got here. And my people suffered because of it. Military were brought in, I think, for a large reason, is to control that manifest destiny narrative. And yeah, I just, I'll get going too far, so I better shut up.
I'm not sure what I have to add to both of your perspectives, which is really interesting, except to say that I think one of the things I teach my students about manifest destiny as representing the power of an idea, and not necessarily a positive power. Because I think one of the things that I have been grappling with 250 celebrations and reflections is how do we, as we mentioned earlier today, how do we account for some of both the trauma within history as well as some of the people who genuinely believed in what they were doing, and yet ideas like manifest destiny were, and I think to some degree remain so powerful that they're almost hidden to a level that until they're excavated out and the sunshine is revealed upon them, it's almost operating in the background without even folks realizing it. And to think through manifest destiny, as both of you said, as like this God-given right, but that has roots in economics and has roots in land dispossession, is worth thinking, absolutely, yeah, thinking through. I'm not sure how much of that had.
Great. Okay. Thank you for venturing into that with me, you guys. So now I think I'd like to talk, let's focus on Utah a little bit, going on these same things we've been talking about. So the land here, the landscape in Utah, and where we are today has been shaped by a lot of these larger forces, such as the military, westward expansion, religious migration. And so there's a couple different things, and I think I'm just going to kind of throw out some of the things we've discussed and see where the conversation goes. So there's a couple really interesting things happening in Utah from the 1700s into the late 1800s. For instance, you have the Mormon Latter-day Saints coming into land that they thought was Mexico, only for a year later for it to become United States land with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They have enslaved people with them who are coming into what was Mexico, which was an emancipated landscape at the time. You also have federal government coming in and establishing a fort on the hill overlooking the Salt Lake Valley, and then bring in Buffalo Soldiers to enforce federal law over the Latter-day Saints. So I just want to kind of turn the time over to my experts here to share just some of your thoughts on these things.
Okay, that was a lot, Jami.
Well, just pick something.
Just pick something.
I don't want to interrupt the conversation, so I just kind of smorgasborded it for you.
Mhm.
Hell, I'll go. I mean, it's complicated. The Mormons were seeking refuge from persecution, so much so that they escaped the United States. It was still part of Mexico. By the way, Mexico had abolished slavery, but yet the Mormons brought slaves. I think about how indigenous people and enslaved people were treated as resources rather than equals. Being oppressed does not prevent someone from participating in oppression. I think the Mormons said, look, I am one, and I think I'm a decent one. So I can say this, not bad-mouthing in any way, but I think we should have known better. I think we had a bigger responsibility, but somehow the persecuted, as they travel across the country, now becomes those who persecute indigenous people and enslaved people. And so I think the Utah settlement story includes both faith and injustice. History cannot be told in a simple term of good or bad. It requires us to hold faith in survival, but it also talks about hope and harm, and refuge and displacement. Stories like Green Flake and others, and how they survived. Utah wasn't built by people seeking freedom. The true freedom was not extended to everyone. But the future will begin when we start telling these truths.
And so let's back up a little bit and just make sure that everybody first understands what Darren is saying here as far as some of the people who came into this territory. For instance, the first 4 men to enter the Salt Lake Valley to help settle the valley, 3 of those 4 men were black. That is a story that is lost in the Utah story. That Brigham Young Company had a Vanguard Company that went before Brigham Young Company, and that Vanguard were 4 men who went into the first encampment that's now near 500 east, and I believe it's 1500 south. They made a little park at that spot. So just really the story of the settlement of Salt Lake Valley itself is completely different to, again, the mythologized part that Kerri talks about, where Brigham Young stands up at the top of the hill and points at the valley and says, this is the place. The decision was already made before he even got here. As a matter of fact, he made the decision before he got to the valley. They knew where they were going. We have a great deal of stories about Utah as a territory, where in the territory itself, the 5th richest man in all of Utah territory was a black rancher. And we lose those type of stories for the dominant narrative. And so I speak in a lot of venues at universities and for historical societies and things of that nature. And one of the common questions that I'm asked is, why are these stories not told? And point blank, my answer is always, because I'm LDS too, is that the Latter-day Saint narrative takes over every narrative, whether it's the military, whether it's black people, whether it's Hispanic, Mexican people, whether it's some of the first settlers in Salt Lake Valley was actually from East India, and people don't know those stories. And so, but that is something that is born, again, out of this idea of manifest destiny, that people feel that the only stories that matter is the dominant culture. And that is what has happened in Utah. Is there's a dominant culture here that has just really kind of suppressed the story of everyone else. And so we spend a lot of times trying to correct that story, because even when you talk about the history of Latter-day Saints, we have to go all the way back to New York and realize that within the first year, within 6 to 9 months of the existence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they were baptizing black men and giving them the priesthood. And so you can't talk about Utah history without talking about New York history and what Joseph Smith was doing, William Smith, and others of the LDS Church were doing in the black community, because Joseph Smith pointedly made it clear that he did not believe in slavery. As a matter of fact, when he went to South Carolina, he said this country would come to war over this enslavement issue that is so predominantly in Charleston, South Carolina. And so we have to look at Utah history and understand and begin to grapple with why was it that the Latter-day Saint Church, in pursuit of freedom, being persecuted by the government and businesses out east because they're out in Utah baptizing black people, baptizing Native American, baptizing Chinese people, baptizing all of these different cultures that are not considered part of the mainstream. Within 40 years of the LDS Church existing in Utah, the people out east had started calling them something other than white. Latter-day Saints weren't even considered white people anymore because they was baptizing all these people. And so it's kind of a hard thing to get into when you're looking at religious freedom, especially of Latter-day Saints, because Latter-day Saints are coming here for religious freedom. But at some point, that religious freedom turns into religious oppression of other people. And with the idea that our theme here is talking about freedom, many of those black folks who were coming to Utah at the time were pursuing freedom. They were pursuing religious freedom, freedom from racism, freedom from economic oppression, a lot of different things. And Utah actually offered that for them for a while.
One of the things that I think of in this time period relative to Utah history, and I really appreciated both of your reflections on Utah history in this time period, but I always like to kind of draw back a little bit and consider Utah within the continental perspective, because it's really easy to sometimes to get lost within the minute details. And one of the things that I'm always reminded of within this time period is just how in flux American identity was. And who got to define American identity at what point in time was probably one of the biggest, and in many ways remains one of the biggest questions of American life, culture, and history. But within that time period, so many people within North American continent were really pushing the edges of what it means to be free, and what it means to have liberty, and what it means to be American. And I'm thinking in particular of how LDS folks coming to Mexican territory it was not a given that they would remain American. And that was actually one of the major issues within the territory over the next 2 decades as to whether or not Utah would be American. And that question was not even settled, I would argue, to some degree until 1896. And then there's even the question of and this was written there was an attempt to solve this as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but were former Mexican citizens now going to become American citizens? And what did that mean? That there was all of a sudden these different Christian religions and different indigenous religions and different economics and even the ways of running and working with environmental impacts and environmental issues within all of this new territory. So one of the big things and one of the big takeaways that I always would think about for these, the couple of decades that we're talking about relative to LDS settlers coming to what then became Utah territory, is what it meant to be an American was very much contingent, meaning that it was in flux. And it was actively being defined by both forces within Utah territory and in particular forces outside of Utah territory. And based around questions of freedom and liberty and who gets to define that. This is the era in which slavery is haunting the nation. And several historians have used that phrase for decades. And the question of slavery is still very much tied to the question of land and who gets to own it and who gets to decide what happens on that land. Whether it is a popular sovereignty question when we're thinking about the spread of slavery into the American West. And when I see this as a Western historian, I still cannot lose, it's very difficult for me to divorce, because I don't think it can happen, is to divorce the idea of the American West from the identity of what it means to be American. I don't think it can be, because it helps to define what it means to be American, both during these decades leading up to the American Civil War, during the American Civil War, and following the American Civil War. So in many ways, the American West, and again, I think other historians have used this, but becomes in many ways the laboratory for American identity. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there wasn't issues, because there was and there remains issues, major issues, huge traumas and huge problems. And yet there is, to me, a moment in time in which that contingent nature in and of itself kind of holds some hope. Yes, historic people screwed some things up, but that doesn't mean that we have to screw some things up. To look at it as somewhat of a simplistic way, but I think the influx nature, the contingent nature of history in and of itself kind of reminds me that our present day is contingent as an influx.
And I think when we think about that, especially when we look at what we want to label as American exceptionalism, and going directly to 1776. And you're looking at what a lot of people, they label it as this American movement as representation, taxation without representation. And what they fail to realize that that's only a part of it. Because really all that they're saying is that we don't want to owe England. We want to be independent. We don't want to pay taxes to anybody, even though it's a half a cent or 1 penny or 1 cent. We don't want to pay it, because in the language of the time, that would make us slaves to England. That would make us slaves to Europe. And while you have these people who are looking to be free from enslavement through taxation, these same business people are looking westward. George Washington is sitting on one of the largest plantations in the country with 150 enslaved people, saying he wants freedom to go into the Ohio Valley and expand. In his expansion, he already finds that who's in the Ohio Valley? The British and the Spanish. So now he's getting charged taxes at home, and he can't even move west because of the English. He's not having the freedom that he wants. Him and his other wealthy ranchers don't have that economic freedom to expand to where they want to do. And as I said earlier, the Spanish just goes around all this, and they go all the way out to Louisiana and everywhere else. But you are dealing with a group of people who want to move west, and not only do they move west and find the British out there, they find this confederation of First Nations there. Because these First Nation people have already dealt with the Europeans for 200 years. So in 1776, you have this huge confederation of native nations saying, what are we going to do about these people encroaching on us from the east? And they get together and they put this loose government to talk about how do we protect ourselves. And most people don't understand that. From that is the first exceptional governmental organizations of the American continent, is that Native American Confederation that then leads to the idea of taking these 13 loose states that we have from Europe and making it a federation. This is all coming from an idea of Native Americans protecting themselves. So even the idea of creating the first 13 colonies into a country didn't come from the Europeans. They came from the Native Americans, right? And so you then get this idea of how do we get even past those native nations. So now we have to contend with the British, we have to contend with the Spanish, we have to contend with the Native Americans. And all we want to do is be free. And at the same time, you got them going through Georgia, marching thousands upon thousands of people in the middle of the winter through the snow out into Oklahoma, where they want to disenfranchise people and take this land. And so when we look at finally reaching Mexico for Latter-day Saints, they're saying we're leaving all of this stuff east of the Mississippi, because by now they've expanded all the way out to the Mississippi River. And the only way we can gain freedom is to get away from the expansion of George Washington. the expansion of the Spanish and expansion of the English, and to go into now literally what is Spanish-speaking territory, which is Mexico.
Preach, brother.
Well, I feel like the time's gone by really quickly, and we just have a few more minutes, and then we're happy to open it up for questions. But just kind of one little last thought to kind of bring this all back full circle is I think, so I've been working on exhibits for over 2 years, and so the semi-quincentennial's been at the front of my brain for almost 3 years now. And one really important distinction that I've made as I've been curating is to always call this a commemoration, not a celebration. Acknowledging that for some people it is a celebration, and that's great. For some people, it's remembering. It is a significant moment in time. It's affected in every individual in this room. It's affected peoples in profound ways, and everywhere in between. And so it is a significant thing for us to remember and to acknowledge. And I really appreciate my panelists here for offering different perspectives. I know I've learned things that I didn't know before, and I hope that you've all heard something from a perspective that maybe you haven't heard before. Because I feel like as Americans who have civic duties, I think that being open to listening to things that we haven't heard before is a really important skill for all of us to have. So with that being said, and I also find such an interesting parallel with the concept where we're talking about the founding of the country, of this great American experiment. The founding fathers launched this revolutionary experiment. They knew they didn't have all the answers and they didn't get it all right. They were fully aware of, it's often called the paradox of liberty, when they are preaching freedom and liberty, when a vast majority of the population is enslaved, when more people can't vote than can vote, when all of these things that we've talked about today are happening, they still had hope and were trying to do something that they thought was good, right? Whether it's spiritual or economic or whatever their motivations were, us coming together now commemorating this is to think about those things, the different catalysts, the different results, and what that means, because now we're all here in this building together in this country, moving forward. And so I guess my last question of the night is, starting with this American experiment, what is the thing you want our audience members or just us as community members to focus on as we think about this commemoration this year?
I'll go. I sent Jami a text earlier today when I saw her question that talked about celebration versus commemoration. And I said, this is the most important question of the night. And I made a few notes, and I hope you'll just let me go through these notes because I think it's important. Celebration implies a shared single experience. And look, I'm going to celebrate the heck out of the birth of America being 250 years old. It's important. Commemoration, though, allows for multiple truths, complexity, and reflection. Not everyone's experienced this founding as freedom. For some, the founding meant independence, opportunity, and self-governance. For others, it meant dispossession, enslavement, and exclusion. Commemoration honors all of those realities. The danger of American exceptionalism suggests that the nation is inherently good and its actions are automatically justified. This mindset often excuses harm violence, and erasure. It replaces accountability with pride. Indigenous peoples see truth-telling as a strength and not a weakness. Honest reflection does not weaken a country. It strengthens trust and belonging. A nation confident enough to face its past can shape a better future. This year we have the chance to choose truth over myth, maturity over nostalgia, and responsibility over denial. Commemoration invites each one of us to remember together without erasing pain, without inflating pride, and with the shared commitment that we need to do better. I think that's the message for our time today, where we're at as a country. And I hope that we can celebrate, but I also hope that we can commemorate.
I just got chills. That was very good, thank you. The only thing I would add to that really amazing way to think through the difference between celebration and commemoration is what you touched on as well, is when we think of commemoration, it acknowledges as, and I say this as a historian, but to me, commemoration acknowledges all of the historic actors that were involved in forming this nation. That it wasn't just one story. As you so eloquently put it, it wasn't just one story. It's multi-layered and it's complex, and that should be celebrated, and that is necessary in order to get at the truth. Is to include and think through everyone's contribution to history, not just that, because America as a nation is complex. And has been so because of this multiple layers of actors throughout history, and including all of them allows us to see a much more complex and truthful historical picture that is necessary to understand what has happened.
I have kind of chosen the word commemoration in most things that Sima Hadithi has done, because while some of these things should be remembered, I don't think they necessarily should be celebrated. Because a lot of it is really very painful. One of the biggest challenges we've had as an African American historical society is like celebrating Buffalo soldiers. Because inevitably we will have someone from the black community who said, why are you celebrating Buffalo soldiers who just came out of slavery and came out west and enslaved Native people? And it is a story that I personally don't want to try to avoid having, but it's a conversation that must be had, because it does seem to have looming contradiction that since the mid-1500s to the end of the Civil War, black people were enslaved on the North American continent, and have those same formerly enslaved men become soldiers and fight for the very people who enslaved them. So that's a lot to dig out in that statement. And so while I want to commemorate those soldiers and remember the service that they provided, for some people that was not a pretty story. It just simply wasn't, because it was part of denial of land, denial of freedom, denial of self-containment, self-assertiveness that was denied people because of what those soldiers did. At the same time, back at home, their families were celebrating because these men are showing that they want to be a part of this country. They are demonstrating their allegiance to a country. And that allegiance has existed even before the United States become a country. And so these are hard stories. Again, like I said, our theme is unity through historical truth, and we have to dig through those truths to try to get to the essence of what it is to be American, and the contradictions that we debate all the time over liberty and freedom in this country.
Before we open it up to questions, is there any last burning comments anybody would like to make? You all did great on your last, by the way, your last statements. Okay. Questions from the audience?
I really don't have a question, but in commemorating these, commemorating the state of Utah or the United States, we really need to remember and be open to discussions on what contributions each group of people contributed to what we have now. Because there are a lot of different nationalities and everything because we aren't just a nation of one nationality. And we need to be able to talk openly about the contributions of the Native people, the Chinese people, all the different people that were here and helped develop what we have today.
I'm a history buff myself a little bit, not like anywhere near the depth there, but I was recently listening to a John Turner history of Brigham Young and really got more into the mind of the complexity of history and the context and how it's messy and it's hard to swallow sometimes. For those who are like learning history, that kind of breaks an original narrative, and as we're adding more complexity, more perspectives into this, how do we use this as an opportunity to heal and to like learn and go forward? I think that's the biggest thing that comes to my mind. It's like we can hear these perspectives, like it's okay to understand that maybe your great-grandparents were not the sharpest and best people, and we wish they weren't products of their time, but they are because that's their time. How do we learn from that and change?
Here, I'll take it. I think the easiest way is to gather together and have these difficult conversations. I think tonight's really important, that you could sit and you could hear multiple perspectives and not having us kill each other over it. But honestly, just sit down and listen more than we talk. Because, and I agree with your comment at first about we need to celebrate everybody. My goodness, isn't it a blessing that we're all not the same, that we're all different? We need to be able to sit down together and have difficult conversations without getting upset and truly listen. And never forget that quiet is a teacher. Sometimes we talk too much and we don't listen enough. But sometimes the silence of a moment when we're together contemplating a question or a thought teaches us way more than somebody could teach us with words. And so I think gathering is the best way. If it's 3 or 4 of you, whatever it is, I think in my indigenous communities, healing is a communal process. It's not done behind closed doors with a therapist and drugs. It's communal because it allows others to have a say, and it allows you to have somebody watching over you as well. So gathering is by far the most powerful thing we can do, especially in a time like this.
One of the big challenges that we have to telling stories like this is when we would do our annual history conference, we begin to recognize that, you know, what we just dropped on people is pretty hard. This is some things that emotionally and psychologically can be very difficult for people to deal with. And so we soon recognized that at the end of our conferences, and Alice came up with this idea, is that we get together in a room and kind of like what you're saying, for healing, and we literally set a therapist in the middle of that room and just said, okay, everybody talk. What questions do you have? How do we help you take this home? Because inevitably, we will always run into what has been called cognitive dissonance, meaning the first truth that you learn as a child is going to always be your truth. So when you learn that George Washington chopped down the cherry tree, that's your truth forever. Even if it's a myth, that's your truth. And now we gather in a room full of people who are now hearing for the first time that perhaps that truth that you was taught is a myth, that it's a fairy tale. And how do we do that? And I think is really helping people break through that cognitive dissonance and as the sister said back there, begin to understand that everyone had something to contribute here. It may not have worked out to everyone's benefit because most things in our lives is not win-win, but we can start changing that. We can stop saying that, you know, there is this limit amount that people can share and both enjoy, both sides enjoy, because right now, especially in these current days, is that we're saying that there's only enough for one side to enjoy. Everybody else just need to stand in line and wait their turn. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can celebrate success without having to celebrate or ignore suffering.
I think that you should take those notes that you took and work them into an op-ed for the newspaper.
Thank you.
Hi, I just want to say thank you to everyone for the panel. Darren and Robert, you both are amazing. I learned a lot from you, Robert, tonight, so thank you for your insight. My question is for Kerri. You mentioned that your interest or you teaches on public lands also. I don't know if I've really heard about that, but I'm wondering, this may be a loaded question, how did public lands in Utah change with the westward expansion?
Okay, we got another hour now.
Yeah, this is a really every historian is going to have this cop out of, oh, it's complex. And it's true in this, and especially in this case, it's true. I'll try and do the very quick. First of all, it's worth remembering that all public lands in North America come first from native land, and were dispossessed often, and I say often because I almost always illegally. When the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, and effectively, like if we are looking at it just on paper, the reality on the ground is always much more complex and always different, and this is where the sort of, I could take 90 minutes minimum and talk about this, comes in, but on the, following the treaty, it becomes largely U.S. federal land. And then when Utah became a state in 1896, is actually part of the Utah state constitution, there are some provisions in there that do sign off basically title to some of the land to Utah, but most of it remains federal. There is a clause in the U.S. Constitution called the Property Clause. It's actually not that well known of a clause, but has to do actually with public lands ownership that has then sort of come back into the limelight, if you will, within the last 20 to 30 years, that basically gives the federal government power over this public lands. I don't know how much more I can get into without turning this into a very long thing, but it's one thing. I think the big takeaway I would say with this is that public lands were not set in stone that they would be federal, but they were also not set in stone that they would be state either, which is a controversial topic in Utah. But the layered jurisdictions, which includes indigenous jurisdictions, remain to this day very complex and difficult to navigate. But also, there is a moment in time in which public lands become a very American experiment. And part of what it means to be American as an identity, because public lands were not common around the rest of the globe. And again, they are stolen native lands. But still, particularly when thinking through how the United States began to form itself as an American, or how it began to form an American identity, particularly in the 20th century, public lands and the glorification of public lands, places like the Grand Canyon, places like Yellowstone, places like Yosemite, become in many ways America's cathedrals and America's monuments. Still, through the erasure of indigenous peoples. And so it's, I don't know how, so great question.
Big question.
Very big question.
I want to thank Monique for asking that question, because I was aware that we did not delve into public lands. So I'm glad I was going to bring it up too, so thank you.
Thank you all for doing this. I really appreciate you doing this, and what you have shared. I'd like you to talk for a minute about how the founding documents that established this continent as the United States of America affected Utah, because at the time, Utah, of course, did not exist. It wasn't even a little seed in somebody's mind. It was Mexican territory. How did the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and I just forgot the name of the documents that Hamilton wrote. How did all of those documents, or any of those documents, impact Utah when it was finally, impact this state when it was finally brought into to become part of the United States?
Kerri, bail us out on this one.
The resident historian. So, again, typical historical cop-out, who's complex? One of the ways I think that we can talk about this again is to go back to the property clause within the Constitution and how that then basically set forth the policy that the federal government would be a primary landowner, and again, landowner meaning the American taxpayers, as a big one of the biggest landowners within the state of Utah. One of the other ways that we can see founding documents come into play for Utah as a territory and then Utah as a state is early or 19th century Utah pioneers drawing on ideas of liberty in order to advocate for entrance into the Union, despite having cultural differences that many within the Republican Party found abhorrent and found as reason to leave Utah out of the Union. And so there's a way in which early LDS settlers within Utah territory were drawing on ideas of liberty in order to advocate for themselves as Americans. I think that's where I will stop myself from going on a 45-minute lecture.
Which leads me into a document that we don't necessarily think of as a founding document, but before this place becomes a country, there are, for almost, well, actually more than 200 years of Virginia government, you know, from Port Comfort and other places where there are the burgesses of these different territories who are making law. One of the documents that come out of this effort for that 200 years, and at that point of about 150 years, excuse me, to be more accurate, 176 years, is the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. This becomes significant in the founding of the country because it is literally the first document in the United States on how to make a slave. The Virginia Slave Codes are coming out of the, what do they call it? The British head rights system, which is using indentured servitude for men from Britain, from England. As I told you, they was trying to find something to do with these young men who were not working. And they were making them indentured servants, putting them on ships and sending them out into the world. These men came to Virginia and they began to serve out their indentureship, which meaning anywhere from 5, 7 to 10 years, they can become free and own property themselves. They are no longer property, they can own property. But as Virginia begins to go through this process, Africans begin to arrive in the colony through no fault of their own. Because remember those folks I told you in Angola who was leaders and priests and all that stuff? They was put on a boat and a bunch of them, about 30 of them, end up in Port Comfort, Virginia. And 2 of those men end up being the largest property holders, among the largest property holders in Virginia. And so you have this British house, or this British-based House of Burgess, who are looking at this as New England, and they're saying, why are these Africans being allowed to own all of this? And they begin, by law, to create a list of laws about why black people can't own property and how black people become property. Till about 1705, they have about 50 some odd different laws against suing white people, owning pigs, owning chickens, who can own a horse, who can't own a horse. And so by 1705, they have this whole list of people who they have created a set of rules that are now, for all intents and purposes, can never be property owners, even if they want to own a chicken. They can never own anything. And this is 71 years before the Declaration of Independence, where one of the major documents that would then later become to influence in Utah is slavery. It codifies slavery for the next 36 years, 37 years. It codifies what slavery is. Then going into the end of slavery and into, the 13th Amendment, who create other type of slavery laws that are no longer called slavery laws. So even after the Civil War, these slavery laws continue on American books. And actually that law still exists for the United States in the 13th Amendment. About 5 years ago, Utah took it out of the Utah State Constitution, but it still exists in the United States Constitution. And so when we're looking at those founding documents, we always thinking about, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and those things. But we have to also consider all of those documents that existed before we became a country, because some of those documents, believe it or not, are still in operation.
Okay. We can end it there. I just wanted to say, before we do, to your point, sir, if you want to see kind of some of these thoughts and notes, each of these wonderful people probably has something to promote, starting, do you just want to end by saying a few words about your books, about some Hadithi, about what you're working on, and just because you can find a lot of these thoughts other places in the world, and I highly recommend that you do.
Wow, I didn't know that. I actually have 2 books, The Bear River Massacre, Shoshone History, and it'll kind of talk through dealing with difficult, hard things. And then I had one come out about 3 months ago called Tending the Sacred, How Indigenous Wisdom Will Save the World. And so I think that's real timely for where we're at. The only thing I want to leave you with is this. America is a great country. We're very blessed. We're very blessed locally in this community. And I serve on the commission for America 250 for the state of Utah. But I'll tell you, I sat in on a listening session at the state capitol where 5 college students from all the universities in Utah participated. And we came together and they talked about creating this big celebration of America 250 and what it would look like. Because the commission I'm on has planned this big year-long celebration that we're going to take part in. But I'm telling you, the students that were there, it was a much different thing. While the people on the commission want to look back with nostalgia at all of the wonderful things the country has done, and rightfully so, the founding documents, all of it, the students could care less. They want to know what the next 250 years are going to be for them and their future. So let's celebrate, commemorate, but let's remember also whose stories are being told and whose stories are being left out, because that's the most important part of the story.
I don't have a book.
Not yet.
But I will tell you that my wife does have a book that was published through Deseret Book called My Lord, He Calls Me, and it talks about the story of Black Latter-day Saints from New York, Massachusetts, and Utah. So if you really want to learn more about what the people who were members of the LDS Church back then thought about the church, all the way up into contemporary times, then that would be a good book to read, My Lord, He Calls Me. But Sima Hadithi has been so focused in so many areas, it becomes just difficult to even keep up with sometimes, because my wife and I started this as a little thing, just something nice to do, because people kept telling us there was no Black history in Utah, but we were helping people do their genealogy, and we had white families who was finding Black members of their church all the way back to the 1800s. And began to question, how can this be? So you can find our website. Alice and I do lifelong learning lectures for the University of Utah. We have an annual conference each September. We, of course, help communities celebrate Black History Month. We help communities celebrate Juneteenth. So there is a lot that we can do to help forward some of the stories that people don't know. We literally focus mostly on Utah. Any of the stuff that I talk about from outside of Utah is just stuff that I learned on the side. And to be honest with you, I don't consider myself a historian. I'm just a producer, because our group have great researchers and teachers and instructors and exhibit creators, and it's my responsibility to make sure that the story gets out there. Anything that you heard from me about Utah is because our researchers did that work and they taught me. So I welcome you, and we do have brochures on the table back here if you want to find out more about us.
I also don't have a book yet. It's a few more years out. It will be about, though, however, Yellowstone bison and Montana disease regulations, including around sovereignty between the state of Montana and indigenous peoples. If you are interested in the history of public lands in the United States more broadly, there's 2 books that I would point you to. The first one is called Making America's Public Lands by Adam Sowards, S-O-W-A-R-D-S. And he does a fantastic job of covering how public lands have developed historically within the United States, including everything that I mentioned very quickly and insufficiently. And then the second book, if you're interested more broadly in the American West and public lands, is Losing Eden by Sarah Dant, D-A-N-T. Both of those books do a really good job of including as many stories as possible and thinking and through and complexifying and, creating this, or not creating rather, but talking through this very complex story of the history of America's public lands and what it means to be thinking through public lands within an American identity, whatever that means. So those are the 2 books that I would point you towards.
So, in addition to the exhibit here at the Brigham City Museum, I mentioned there's the larger exhibit, which is at the state capitol. It will be there the entire year through December of 26. And then kind of a companion exhibit to it will be opening in the new Museum of Utah, which opens on June 27th to the public. So if you don't know about the Museum of Utah yet, come and ask me. Monique is also here. She's standing up, but she works for the Utah Historical Society, and she actually helped me curate the exhibit. We talk a lot about the idea of commemoration in the peoples of Utah in that exhibit. Robert and Alice are coming up to the Hiram City Museum in 2 Saturdays, on the 28th, and Robert's giving a presentation at 1 o'clock on Black Americans and their contributions to the Revolution. So if you want to continue and learn more from Robert, come over the hill and see us on the 28th. And then we're also doing some little activity rotation things too. We're open 10 to 3 that day. So that's an opportunity to learn more about the work that Samahadithi is doing. And I think I just want to end with just one last thought, and it speaks to a question that someone asked, and also Darren's point about looking forward. I've just recently had the pleasure of meeting Kerri, but I've worked with Robert and Darren for several years now, and have opened, as a museum director, have opened my space to both of them, and love to have them come and teach the community their perspective. And I love it when they come and offer their perspective. And I would have to say that they are absolute scholars and experts at sharing hard history in a very meaningful way. I feel like both of these men and Alice and the work that they do is the example of how we should have these conversations. And so I just want to say how much I admire both of you and appreciate your willingness to have these difficult conversations. And none of you got up and stormed out, and you're here with us. And I'm just really grateful for your willingness to be open to hearing something from a new perspective. And I'm really grateful for all of our panelists for being brave to share these perspectives and to help as we commemorate this year of this great American experiment, that as Americans we can all look forward and do better and to continue to improve on the American experiment.